Hello there. It's October 2020. They said we wouldn't make it, but here we are at the Linnaean Society of New York's second online speaker meeting. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ken Chea. I'm the president of the Linnaean Society of New York, and I'd like to call this meeting to order. I'm delighted to be here tonight to welcome our members, our friends, our guests, and everyone else to the October speaker meeting of the Society's 2020-2021 season. According to the participants list, there are 132, 33, 34, 35 people now online viewing this with 230 registered. So that's a big crowd. Welcome again to all. I'd like to give a quick shout out, if I may, to my team of fellow officers, council members, committee members, and past presidents whose blood, sweat, and tears and endless emails kept us moving forward this year despite COVID-19. Without their hard work and support, we would not be streaming live right now or sponsoring field trips, which are now in full swing with COVID-19 safety guidelines in place. For more information about our programs or to register for a field trip, please go to our website at linnaeannewyork.org. That's LINNAENNEWYORK.org. Because this is still new and evolving, I'd like to take a moment to explain a few things. The American Museum of Natural History has canceled all programming events through November of this year. It's quite likely that we will not get to resume holding our meetings in the Linder Theater at the museum until sometime in 2021. We have to await word from the museum on that in the months to come. We will keep you all updated on our website as to when we may expect to return to the museum. Now, the good news, however, is that until we're able to resume meetings in the Linder Theater, we plan to bring you our monthly speaker meetings right here online via Zoom, which allows us to reach an even bigger base of our community. For tonight's program, a few ground rules. We have disabled the Zoom chat feature. We have also disabled the microphone, so you don't have to worry about muting yourself if your dog is barking or if your neighbors are making noise. We have also disabled your video. No one can see you, so no worries about wardrobe or if you're having a bad hair day. Sit back, relax, be yourself, and enjoy tonight's program. One of the changes in our online format is that at the moment we are only featuring one speaker at each meeting. When we are able to resume meetings at the museum, we plan to switch back to two speakers. Tonight, however, and here's your cue, Ruth. Tonight, however, by using Zoom's polling feature, you will have the opportunity right now to let us know if you would like to see more than one Zoom speaker meeting a month. Or is one Zoom meeting enough for now? We'd like to know what you, our membership, thinks. So as always, your voice counts. Please go to the polling feature found in the center of the screen right now and let us know. Enter either one or two meetings, what you'd like to see from us. We are your society and we want to try and deliver the goods. Another feature that we have not disabled is Zoom's Q&A feature, found at the bottom of your screen window. During tonight's program, you may use that feature to send us a question. Following our speaker's presentation, our Vice President, Rochelle Thomas, will take some questions from the audience for our speaker. I'm very excited about tonight's speaker, Jonathan C. Slaght, who traveled to the forests of Eastern Russia, a place that most Westerners will never get a chance to see, to find and study Blakiston's fish owls. But before we can go there, I need to take care of some very brief business right here. Because we have recently taken the opportunity to vote by email, and thank you, members, for returning your votes to us. I have only 2 business items to present this evening. Item number 1, with 91 votes of approval and 0 votes of opposition, it gives me great pleasure to announce Amy Simmons as the new recording secretary of the Linnaean Society of New York. Thank you, Amy. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you as an officer, and I look forward to working with you in the days ahead. And item number 2, again, with 91 votes and 0 votes of opposition, it gives me great pleasure to announce the following 14 applicants as new members of the Linnaean Society of New York. Crystal Thiel, sponsored by Barbara Saunders. Reese Hunt, sponsored by Barbara Saunders. Michelle Zorzi, sponsored by Chuck McAlexander. Will Test, sponsored by Ken Chea. Laura Weir, sponsored by Mary Beth Cooper. Tina Lee, sponsored by Ken Chea. Dao Lee Goff, sponsored by Rochelle Thomas. Betsy DeFelice, sponsored by Dawn Hannay. Nancy Turner, sponsored by Miriam Rakowski. Virginia De La Agre, sponsored by Will Papp. Steve Holleran, sponsored by Miriam Rakowski. Nithya Saurirajan, sponsored by Chuck McAlexander. Matthew Ring, sponsored by Chuck McAlexander. And Richard Woods, sponsored by Miriam Rakowski. If any of you are out there watching right now, imagine you are hearing a thunderous applause in the theater, at the museum, and congratulations to all. Welcome to the Linnaean Society of New York. And by the way, if any of you are out there wondering about becoming a member, we would love to hear from you. Just go to our website, linnaeannewyork.org, and you will find all information that you need. And just in case you need a sponsor and you don't know many members yet, I will be happy to sponsor you. You can contact me about sponsorship or any of the other officers of the Society by going to the bottom of our website homepage and clicking on Contacts. There you will find our email addresses, and you can contact any one of us for more information. Please remember, any society or organization is only as healthy as its growing and diverse membership. We would love to hear from you and to welcome you to our community. And now at last, it's my pleasure to announce this evening's speaker. Blakiston fish owls are the largest owls in the world, with 6-foot wingspans and weights in the range of bald eagles. These endangered birds are found at very low densities across Northeast Asia, where they hunt for salmon and other aquatic prey in clean mountain rivers and nest in the cavities of enormous trees. Jonathan C. Slaght of the Wildlife Conservation Society has spent more than 20 years working on conservation issues in the Russian Far East, 15 of those years with Blakiston's fish owls, and is a foremost expert on the species. He will provide an overview of the landscape and the diverse wildlife found within the region, followed by a description of Blakiston's fish owl biology, ecology, and the efforts of Slaght and his colleagues to protect them from extinction. Jonathan C. Slaght is the Russian and Northeast coordinator for the Wildlife Conservation Society, managing research projects that involve endangered species and coordinating WCS avian conservation activities along the East Asia Australasian flyway from the Arctic to the tropics. He received a PhD from the University of Minnesota. Slaught's writings, scientific research, and photographs have been featured by the BBC World Service, the New York Times, The Guardian, Smithsonian Magazine, The New Yorker, and Audubon Magazine, among others. He translated Vladimir Arsenyev's 1921 natural history classic along the Ussuri Krai, and he authors a blog for Scientific American about his fieldwork entitled East of Siberia. His experiences tracking Blakiston's fish owls in Russia, owls of the eastern ice, was published in June by Farrar, Straus, and Giraud, and longlisted for a 2020 National Book Award for Nonfiction. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jonathan C. Slaght.
Hi, Ken. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks to you and to the Society. I'm thrilled to see 187 people logged in. That's a great turnout. Thank you. Okay, I am going to talk to you this evening about Blackeston's fish owls. This is just an enormous bird. I mean, Ken mentioned that a little bit in his intro. And females of this species exceed 11 pounds. They have these 6-foot wingspans, and they stand at 2.5 feet tall. That's essentially the size of a fire hydrant. And I wrote a book about these birds that Ken alluded to. But the book isn't just about the owls. It's about the people that share the landscape with the owls. It's about field work. But before I talk about the book and about the owl, I want to give you a feel for the place where these owls live, where I've been going since 1995, and just so you can sort of kind of be there with me as I'm walking in these woods. So this story takes place in the southern part of the Russian Far East. It's way out on the Sea of Japan. Now, the capital city is Vladivostok. There are about 2 million people that live in the province. So here's the city. There's about 1 million people here. So half the population of the province is just in this one city. And really the rest of the population is living in relatively small villages where populations can be measured in the thousands, the hundreds, or in some cases even the dozens. And the villages really, they're tucked where they can fit between the rivers and the Sakhalin Mountains, which dominate most of the province. So the coastline here is just spectacular. I mean, in many cases, it's almost like the mountains stop mid-slope. And it's just a very, very wild country, low human population densities. And the wildlife of the region is just spectacular. There's this bizarre mix of, so it's a temperate forest. It's 45 degrees latitude, but there's this mixture of subtropical species creeping north and boreal species creeping south and intermingling in this temperate forest. So that's why you have species like tigers, what you typically associate with steamy subtropical jungles, things like tigers and things like leopards, sharing the same forests with things like bears and lynx. So this photo here is from a camera trap that set in the Russian Far East that captured the 4 different cat species that are found here. So this is a composite, but they all walk past the same trap. So we've got a tiger, we have an Amur leopard. Those are both subtropical species. A Eurasian lynx, which is one of these boreal species, and then a leopard cat, which is another subtropical species. So I did mention bears. So this part of the world is the only place where you have tigers and brown bears sharing the same forests. They do interact a lot, and they do sometimes kill each other. So some of the other what I consider interesting species in the region as far as mammals go are, this is a raccoon dog. If you're unfamiliar with these, this is a true dog. It's a canid, and it's the only member of the dog family that hibernates in winter. This is another one of these subtropical species where Primoria in Russia is really the northern extent of its range there. There's wild boar. The largest wild boar subspecies in the world are found there, the primary prey item of tigers. There's long-tailed goral. These are weird goat-like creatures. There's thought to be fewer than 1,000 left in the wild, and they mostly inhabit those really steep, those vertical cliffs along the coast that I showed you a moment ago. There's Siberian musk deer. Now, if you haven't seen a musk deer before, you'll note that males have these elongated canines sticking out of their mouths. Females don't have this, but it's fairly uncommon for a deer to have teeth like that. And so, those are all inhabitants of the Cenarius Mountains, which you can see by this map. Is sort of that that topography there. Well, you'll notice that there's a very large lake over to the west, and the border is shared with China, and there's a vast lowland around this lake. This is Lake Hanka. It's an enormous body of water, so about 4,000 square kilometers, and it's surrounded by this matrix of wetland, which is really it's just a phenomenal place. You have these floating masses of vegetation that move around as the wind blows them and run into each other and reposition. And what that means is that it's a really good place for migratory birds. I mean, Lake Hanka is one of the premier migratory stopovers for birds of the East Asian, Australasian flyway. There's hundreds of thousands of water birds, especially, move through here. There's things like Far Eastern white storks, an endangered species. They breed around Lake Hanka. There's these little guys. This is a reed parrotbill. They have really short wings, and the only place you can find them in Russia is right around Lake Hanka. One of the conservation issues with these guys is that there are a lot of fires set in spring on purpose of some of these grasslands, and they're just little guys, and they have little tiny wings, and they sometimes just can't escape the flames. This is a Bear's pochard. It's a diving duck. It's a critically endangered species. The breeding range used to include Lake Hanka. As far as I know, I have the last record of one from, I want to say 2012. From this lake, I saw a small group there. And just in general, the birds of Primoria are fantastic. Also, it's this mixture of subtropical things and boreal things and temperate things, and it's really just a fantastic mix. We got northern ravens are there. Mandarin ducks are in the wild there. Spoonbill sandpipers, they use the coast of Primoria as they migrate from their breeding in the Russian Arctic to Southeast Asia. It's a critically endangered species. The scaly-sided mergansers breed in the oak forests along the rivers in Primoria. And the raptor diversity is fantastic as well. This is an oriental honey buzzard. Its primary prey is the grubs of ground nesting wasps. And I don't know how well you can see it, but the feather structure on these birds is remarkable. It's almost like plate armor. The feathers, especially around the eyes, the feathers are very, very waxy, very, very hard, because they're going in, they're digging up these nests and going after the grubs. Stellar sea eagle, the largest eagle in the world, at least by weight. They winter in Primoria. They don't breed there, but every winter I'm seeing these birds over there. And these birds are big. I mean, that's the hand of a normally sized human, and you can compare that to the footprint of one of these eagles on the beach. So speaking of big, so the bird on the left here is a juvenile stellar sea eagle. And the thing that's dwarfing, or that's making it look like a small bird, is a juvenile Cenarius vulture. These are birds that breed in Mongolia, but juveniles especially winter in some numbers, a couple hundred, along the Sea of Japan coast. Another raptor there that's found all over is the golden eagle. A colleague of mine set up some camera traps to track tigers. And one of the things she got instead was this golden eagle taking down a sika deer, a year-old sika deer, and killing it. We wrote a paper about this together for the Journal of Raptor Research. So this is where I was in the Peace Corps in the year 2000. The first time I saw Blakiston's fish owl. And in general, I mean, Primoria is just this place of remarkable discoveries. I mean, almost every time I go out for a walk in the woods there or along the coast, I almost always see something that's new or exciting or otherwise just a pleasure to stumble upon. So I was in Lazo, a small village in the year 2000 in the Peace Corps when I first saw a Blakiston's fish owl. And I'm going to read just the first paragraph from my book, from the prologue that describes this encounter. Okay. I saw my first Blakiston's fish owl in the Russian province of Primoria, a coastal town of land hooking south into the belly of Northeast Asia. This is a remote corner of the world, not far from where Russia, China, and North Korea meet in a tangle of mountains and barbed wire. On a hike in the forest there in 2000, a companion and I unexpectedly flushed an enormous and panicked bird. Taken to the air with labored flaps, it hooted its displeasure, then landed for a moment in the bare canopy perhaps a dozen meters above our heads. This disheveled mass of wood-chip brown regarded us warily with electric yellow eyes. We were uncertain at first which bird actually we'd come across. It was clearly an owl, but bigger than any I'd seen, about the size of an eagle, but fluffier and more portly, with enormous ear tufts. Backlit by the hazy gray of a winter sky, it seemed almost too big and too comical to be a real bird, as if someone had hastily glued fistfuls of feathers to a yearling bear, then propped the day's beast in a tree. Having decided that we were a threat, the creature pivoted to escape, crashing through the trees as its 2-meter wingspan clipped the lattice of branches. So these are the photos I took of that bird that I just described in that encounter. And I honestly didn't know what it was. I didn't think it was a Blakiston's fish owl. I mean, I'd heard about these birds for years, but they seemed too exotic and too rare to be right on the edge of this village where I'd been living for 2 years. But I took photos. This was the pre-digital days. It took about a week for me to be able to get into the city. It was about a 4-hour bus ride to where I could get the film developed. And once calm and collected, I was able to figure out this was indeed a Blakiston's fish owl. Now, I mean, even by owl standards, these things are weird. And there's a number of reasons why. And I'm going to go through just a couple of the basic ones. The first thing that's weird about these birds is that they duet. Duetting is pretty uncommon among birds in general, and to have a synchronized duet the way the fish owls do is quite rare. So in this, I have a short clip here, and this is a territorial pair. The male is on the left and the female's on the right, and you can see that the male already has his throat patch. His throat patch is already bulged out, right? So he's already kind of signaling to the female that he's about to initiate the duet. And it's a very, very synchronized thing. It takes place just over 3 seconds, where he calls first, she responds, he calls again, and she responds again. So let's see how this works. Okay, so did you see how synchronized that was? I mean, people who hear these birds in the forest just assume it's one bird making those 4 notes, not 2 birds working together. So another thing, I mean, you're all bird people, so you know all this. But another thing that when people think of owls, one thing they think of is super sensitive hearing. And that's, because of facial discs. We look at some of these other owl species, these spotted owls in California. This is a great horned owl in my neighborhood in Minneapolis. These are barn owls from the internet. And they all have these very, very defined facial discs. And if you look at a Blakiston's fish owl, sure, there's a bit of a facial disc there, more than not, but nonetheless, it's not nearly as defined as some of these other owls. Another thing that people often think about with respect to owls is silent flight. And And that's, again, you're all bird people, so I'm sure you know all this, but if you look at at this primary feather of Eurasian eagle owl, you can see these barbules along the leading edge of the primary. And of course, what that does is dissipate the air as the bird flaps, which essentially gives the bird a cloaking device and makes it silent. Now, compare that to a Blackiston's fish owl primary feather. I mean, it's lacking the barbules. I mean, these birds are loud when they're flying by. If it's a silent night, if you can't hear the river, if there's any wind, you can hear these things as they flap past. And I really think that these are physical adaptations that were lost among these owls, just based on what they're hunting and where they're doing their hunting. They're hunting in these shallow, rocky, fast, loud waterways. So if you have something with sensitive hearing, like a barn owl, trying to keep its sanity in a place as loud as a river, I think it would just go nuts if its hearing was so sensitive. So I think that's one reason that they don't have the defined facial discs. And also, their primary prey are aquatic. It's mostly salmonid fish, which are underwater. And so if an owl is flapping around in the canopy from one tree to another, I mean, a fish underwater isn't going to notice it anyway. So these are adaptations that I believe these birds have lost for those reasons. Now, there are essentially two features on a landscape that fish owls need to lead happy, productive fish owl lives. The first is an enormous canopy in a really enormous tree. And these are 200-300-year-old old growth poplars and elms that grow large enough to have cavities big enough to fit a fish owl. There's some examples of some of those cavities in trees in the forest. Now, fish owls lay 1 to 2 eggs every other year. So they typically do not breed every year. They typically lay 1 to 2 eggs, and that often just results in one fledgling. Now, this bird stays in the nest for about a month and a half, and then once it fledges, it stays on its natal territory with its parents for at least a year and a half. So an exceptionally long predispersal period for an owl. And I think part of that is, it's tough being a fish owl. They live in these places where most waterways freeze in winter, and it's not that easy to figure out how to catch fish. So I think these young birds, as they start to grow into adulthood, they're still around their parents, learning how to master their trade. And I also think that's why they tend to breed only every other year, because in the off year, they tend to have an extra bird flapping around their territory. So in addition to big trees, another thing that fish owls need to exist is, I just alluded to it, open water in winter. It's not easy in a place where temperatures dip to the -30s to have these open patches of water. There happen to be a number of radioactive radon hot springs in Primoria. And so these, the gases seep into the channels in certain places and warm the water just enough to keep the water from freezing. And so these are patches that are reliably ice-free year in and year out. And so what the fish owls look for is patches of forest that have the big trees to nest in, but then also some open water in winter. So there weren't really many conflicts between the needs of fish owls and the needs of humans leading up until quite recently. These images here are from indigenous Udege from Primoria about 100 years ago. And they fished and they hunted. They'd sometimes hunt fish owls, especially in autumn, as the fish owls were gearing up for winter and were putting on these thick fat reserves. Udege hunters would target the owls then to eat these big fatty birds, but that's pretty minimal take. And they also would spread their wings and tails to use as fans, as you can see in the bottom right there. But and even going into most of the Soviet Union, there wasn't really a conflict between humans and owls. This map here shows just Ternay County in Primoria, which is the northernmost part of the province, and where most of the book I wrote takes place. So you can see in 1984, there were fewer than 150 miles of road, and the rest of it was just wilderness and mountains and rivers. Fast forward 20 years, and the road network has just absolutely exploded from fewer than 150 miles to nearly 3,000 miles of road. So we went from very few interactions between humans and fish owls to the potential for very regular interactions and potential problems for the owls. And so really it was a sudden emergence of threats, but no plans to mitigate the problem that prompted me to study this bird. These fish owls and their habitat are protected by law. So logging companies, for example, are not allowed to disturb their habitat or the birds. But if there's no conservation plan to guide those actions, they have nothing to base their management on. And because fish owls are cryptic, they're low densities, there was really very little data for anyone to work with. So I hooked up with these two guys. They're both named Sergey Avdyuk and Sergey Sormich, who had been studying fish owls or looking for fish owls for about a decade before I got involved. So they've been working with fish owls since the mid-1990s. So I teamed up with them in 2005 to conceive a PhD project at the University of Minnesota, where the plan was to find fish owls, catch them, give them GPS data loggers, little GPSs on their backs, see where they went, and then use that information about how they're using their habitat to build a conservation plan to protect them. And so the book is really broken into the three stages of this project. The first stage was a 2-week expedition that was just nuts. I mean, we flew into the northernmost settlement in the province, where there were no roads leading there at the time. Just flew in by helicopter. Loaded all our gear onto there were 4 of us onto 2 snowmobiles and sleds with everything we could fit. And then went from that village 80 kilometers following the river, the frozen river, to the coast where there was a second village and the end of the expedition. And all along that way of the 80 kilometers looking for fish owls. And so for me, this project, this section, this portion of the project was really about learning, getting the feel for fish owl field work, like learning what to look for, gaining some skills that I could then apply at later stages of the project. And so we're really looking for 3 things when we were on this expedition. First thing was tracks. So anytime that we see one of these open patches of water, scan it closely, look for maybe some wing marks in the snow, or more importantly, tracks where an owl was walking up and down the bank, looking for a spot to wait in ambush to jump in and catch some fish. The owls don't call with any regularity, really. So just doing surveys in the evening or in the morning aren't necessarily going to tell you the owls are there. And one of the reasons we were doing work in winter was because of this, because we could find evidence of them in winter like this. So another thing we're looking for was feathers. Fish owls always seem to be releasing these semi-plume feathers that are these big fat sausage-like things, and they cling to branches. And so again, in winter without foliage, you can see these things. If the light's catching them just right, it's almost like this little neon flag letting you know that there's fish owls somewhere nearby. And then also, anytime we'd see one of these big trees, we'd approach it and try to figure out if there's a cavity in there, and if there is, might a fish owl be nesting in there? There aren't that many of these big trees on the landscape, so we pretty much tried to approach every one we came across. Now, the problem with how we had scheduled this 2-week expedition was that it really straddled winter and spring. And what we found was that we were basically on the river too long, and spring was catching up with us. And when a frozen river is your only travel corridor, it got dicey. This picture here shows a naled, which is a Russian word meaning essentially on the ice. And it's where water is somewhere upstream, bursts through the ice, and then flows atop the ice. And by just looking at it, you don't know if it is just a knotweed, and if you step on it, it's only going to be, you know, this deep or a little bit deeper, or if you step there, you're going to crash through and go right to the bottom of the river. So these things were a constant nemesis on that expedition. And we eventually got to the point where we stopped surveying for owls and just gunned it for the coast because we were running out of time. I mean, you know, ice was breaking off and falling behind us as we snowmobile over it. So it was a bit of a disaster. So here's a short clip of us reaching one of these knollids and trying to get across it. Oops. So it's honestly, it's not a good feeling to be on precarious ice, knowing that your only option forward is precarious ice, and you can't go back because the ice is no longer there because it fell into the rushing water. Okay, so that was part one of the book. So part two of the book was then a 2-month period where just Sergei and I, so we're working as a team of two, drove around on that road network that I showed you a map of earlier, revisiting sites that he had found at some point in the past decade, just to see if there were some owls still at some of these territories and trying to figure out if these were birds that we could include in the capture component of the project, which would be starting the next year. So we just, you know, stay in hunter cabins as we found them, you know, visit some of Sergei's friends, and it was pretty good part of the program, and much less stress than the first 2 weeks. And then in January 2007, I went back again to Russia, and again, just with Sergei, tried to catch some owls. You know, no one had really caught adult Blackiston fish owls before, so we didn't really know what would work. You know, different capture methods work with different raptors. I talked to Pete Bloom, a raptor capture specialist in California. He gave me some ideas about what trap might work. So I went over there with you know, a bunch of raw materials and an open mind, just trying to see what would work. And it was a pretty awful period of my life. I mean, even to this day, I think back on it. So, you know, so Sergei and I were largely living in a tent for weeks at a time in pretty challenging conditions. You know, it was very cold, and we weren't catching owls. You know, so we'd set these traps along the river in these territories where we knew owls were. We could hear them vocalizing, but they just weren't coming in. We weren't able to catch them. So we were trying different methods, trying different things. And again, you know, we're living in this tent, and it's minus 30 something. And I remember, you know, one night, you know, Sergei and I were both in our sleeping bag, just laying next to each other, and you know, everything's cinched down to mummy bag, where the only thing exposed is really my nose and a little bit of my upper lip, just so I can breathe. And it was so cold that our exhalations were freezing to the inside of the tent. And anytime one of us would move a little bit, it would just rain down this fine mist of ice, and it was just awful. But then Sergei ran into this guy in the woods named Anatoly, and he's a hermit. I mean, he'd been living in the woods for about 10 years on his own, and he had occupied a former hydroelectric station that had been operational during the Second World War, and he was just living there. And as it turned out, where his cabin was right between these two fish owl territories. We were trying to catch birds. And so he let us stay with him. He had an extra room in his cabin there. And so, yeah, so at least we still had trouble catching birds, but at least we had a dry, warm place to sleep at night. Now, you know, field work here is really just like life in rural Primoria. I mean, if people want water, oftentimes you take a bucket, go down to the river to get some. If you want fish, you punch a hole through the ice and dip in your line. So it's you know, it's challenging. It's a very challenging place to do field work. And so then right before the end of the field season, I'd just about given up all hope on the PhD, on ever catching owls. We started to catch birds. We put together, you know, different components of different traps, and we found this combination that seemed to work. And over a week-long period, I think we caught 3 birds, and we got 4 in general, 4 in total that season. Right before the snow was melting, and the capture season would have ended. So that was just fantastic. And if you key in on, you sort of see something there maybe on the back of this fish owl. That's one of these GPS data loggers that we're putting on these birds. So it attaches, it's a harness transmitter. So it just sits on the back, and there's loops that go over and under the wing that keep the unit in place. And so these are data loggers that would record 1 or 2 locations a day for about a year, depending on how it's programmed. But in order to save the battery life, in order to get more of those locations, these units only receive signals. They don't transmit. So in order to access that data, we'd have to recapture these same birds at some point in the future and then download that information. And these birds are long-lived. There's a record of a bird that's close to 30 years old in Japan, where there's a small but highly endangered population. And because they're so large, they don't really have natural predators. And they're very restricted to where they can hunt in winter. So the combination of those things, being that it's probably gonna be alive the next year because it's old and nothing is really targeting it, and the fact that there's only a few places where we can try to catch it that it can hunt in the next year, gave us confidence that we'd be able to recapture them. And we were able to recapture all of our birds in the future. And the tags didn't always work, but we're always able to recapture our birds. So after the first year, that was 2007. So the 2008 to 2010 field seasons, Sergey and I got a little more serious, where we had a capture methodology. So we got this truck. This is a Gaz 66 with a custom-built living compartment on the back. There's 2 rooms back there with a wood stove. You can see the stove pipe sticking out the back. And drove this truck into more remote places. In some cases, as far as the road would take us, park it there, and then go further on foot or on snowmobile to access some owl territories and capture more birds. And there's a revolving cast of field assistants over the years. Some stayed with us for 1 season, or maybe a few seasons, some for just a couple of weeks. Because, not everyone's willing to spend 6 to 8 weeks at a time living in a truck with 3 to 5 other dudes in the middle of winter. So we took who we could get. So this is me in the back of the Gaz 66 into the sleeping compartment there. 3 people would sleep in that spot right there. And this was a weird part of my life in the sense that I'd be in the Gaz with Andre and Shurik, parked next to a river in the middle of a Russian winter. And then I'd go back to Minnesota in the spring, and I'd do normal things like go bowling or get married. And then a few months later, I'd be back in a truck in the middle of the Russian woods with Shurik and Andre again. So it was definitely a double life, living a very, very rustic life in the Russian woods and leading a relatively normal life in the United States. So I would like to underscore quite how remote this place is, and how people are really on their own when they're out here. This is Sergey's pickup, and we've been driving in an old logging road that, of course, hadn't been plowed, so it was deep snow. And at some point there, our tire had been punctured, and because it was deep snow and a really uneven road, we couldn't tell that the tire was flat, and the tire ended up becoming unseated from the rim. Now, typically to fix that, you need a special tool, which we certainly didn't have in the truck. Right here, we're 80 kilometers from the closest human settlement, which is a hunting village of just a couple hundred people, which probably didn't have the right thing either. So what are you going to do? Thankfully, Sergey is a remarkably resourceful person, and just the perfect person to be in the Russian forest with. So his solution here was to pour some gasoline inside the tire and then light it on fire. So then the resultant explosion would reseat it. And that's what he did. And there's a short video of it. It happens quickly, so please pay attention. And the GAZ 66 was constantly breaking down, and I don't know how many times Sergei had to fix this thing, but I'd probably still be in the Russian woods if not for Sergei. So I owe much of the success of the project and and my life to Sergei. So a weird thing about field work in these areas is that there aren't a lot of strangers that come to these forests, and so when you do, you're an automatic magnet for random people driving by or walking by. These were two young lads who kind of knocked on our door at very late at night and just wanted to see what we were doing. And when something like that happens, you have to be inviting and friendly and engage these folks in conversations. You don't want to make local enemies. If those kids had shown up and we said, beat it, and then the next day our truck goes through the river and those guys happen to walk by, they're not going to help us. But if we're friendly, we show them hospitality, we engage, then we have local allies, and that's for remote places. It's extremely important. And so over the years, I still go back to some of these places. There are people that I've known now for 15 years. I sometimes bring things from the United States to these Russian village guys that they certainly have no access of getting there. And they do things like they bring us fish or help us out of jams like this. So so what's the big deal about all this? So why is this weird story about looking for owls in Russia? How does this apply to the Linnaean Society of New York? Well, I think it's important to recognize that everything's connected. I think, COVID is showing us that, right? That something that happens halfway across the world is, a month later impacting us pretty severely here. And so remember I showed a map of the road network in Ternate County. So this is one of those roads here, crossing the river valley, the dirt track, and then the frozen river going between it. And so this is some of the data we got from the owl. There's 5 different owls represented here, 2 individuals from 2 pairs and a single bird, and light blue is hard to see up north. Nearly every single GPS location for our owls were in the river valleys, the exact same place that the roads go. And really, this is what conservation is. Like these are the types of problems we try to solve. We have this this potential conflict between the owls and human resource use, and we're trying to use science to solve some of these problems that benefit everyone. So most of those roads that I showed you, they're logging roads. I mean, the human population density in Ternate County is low. It's about 10,000 people total, but there's a lot of roads. So there's a lot of wood being moved out. Most of it is fast-growing species. Like we have white birch here. There's some larch, and there's some fir. And so some of this wood makes its way to North America. There's wood from Primoria becomes floors in North America and in Europe. People also use these roads to access fish. Some of it, like in these photos here, is poaching, but some of it's commercial use. And fish from Primoria's waters is sold all across Asia. So the way that by implementing conservation management that benefits the owls, we're also benefiting the sustainable use of these resources that matter to everyone in the world. So, I got a PhD writing all this stuff up, published in scientific journals. But unfortunately, a problem with my field is this is often where this ends. It ends in the journal, and people move on with their conservation recommendations. I mean, I feel lucky in that, I continue to work in the place where I made those recommendations. So since 2011, when I got my degree, I've been able to implement some of these things. So we're working with the primary logging company in the region to make sure that how they're logging and how they're building new roads is minimally has a minimal impact on the owls. So we created this map showing 60 locations that were really important for the owls. And so these are spots that the logging company knows now to avoid for harvest and for new roads. And thankfully, there's not much of a conflict here. First of all, these big trees that the owls need to nest in, they're not really commercially valuable. And a lot of these river valleys are wide enough that if we say, okay, this spot over here is important for owls, they can still easily just find another spot of the valley to put their road in. Another management recommendation that we're working with the logging company to implement is blocking off access to some high biodiversity, some roads that lead into high biodiversity areas that are good not just for owls, but for tigers and other animals as well. So showing this map again, and just an example, like blowing up to one spot, you probably can't see it too well, but there's this one road loop that goes up one river valley, goes over the crest of the mountains, then comes back out the other side. And so the logging company blocked access off the main road in just two spots. In one place put up a big berm, and then the spot knocked out a bridge, and that essentially eliminated human access to these two river drainages, which is good for owls and biodiversity. So another thing that we've started to do is put up nest boxes. We found that these trees are so big and old that they're not just logging companies do sometimes cut them down to build bridges, but they're also susceptible to natural decay and naturally falling over. There was one territory that we'd monitored for a decade where they went through 4 nest trees, and then Sergey and I were back in 2015, and the birds were there. They were vocalizing, but they weren't breeding because there weren't any more trees for them to nest in. So we took a cue from Japanese fish owl biologists who've been putting up nest boxes since the early 80s. They more than doubled the population there from, I believe, 80 birds to just fewer than 200 since the early 80s with some pretty serious conservation interventions, and this is one of them. So we got these barrels. They used to have soybean oil, punched holes in the sides, affixed a perch, and went to this territory and put it up in the tree, just to see if the owls would find it. And they did, and it took them about a week and a half to find this barrel that we nailed to the tree. And so since 2015, this one pair has bred 3 times in this nest box and raised at least 3 chicks. So I have to say it's been a very satisfying project for me. Wildlife conservation, like many professions, it's filled with uncertainty. We can wildlife biologists can spend their entire lives designing studies and collecting data and using that information to guide conservation, but it's hard to know sometimes if what we're doing has any real impact. So knowing that right now, there are fish owls flapping around Primoria because Sergey and I strapped some barrels to trees because we're working with loggers to reduce the industry's harm, and we're limiting road access to some areas important for owls, it feels good. We're not saving the entire species here, but we estimate that there's about 150 pairs, 200 pairs of fish owls that live in Primoria, which is potentially a quarter of the population. And all these birds are under these management interventions. So we are making a difference, at least to some owls. I will say though that the owls do not always seem to appreciate our efforts. All right. Well, great. That's what I have. I am eager for questions if anybody has them. Let's see. Did I?
Yeah, no, perfect. Jonathan, thank you so much. I'm not going to ask the question that everyone is going to ask, and that's, will you please take me with you on your next expedition? This goes without saying, but we have a lot of really interesting questions. I'm going to start, and for people who still want to ask questions, you can type them into the Q&A box now, and I will try to get to them. First question is from earlier in the talk. What was the elm species?
I'm sorry, what was the what?
The elm species. They wanted to know the species.
Oh, yeah. It's Manchurian elm. So it's Japanese poplar and Manchurian elm are the 2 primary fish owl nest tree species.
And then a question I think a lot of people are going to ask about your survival skills. And so someone wants to know, did you hunt or bring food?
So when we go into the woods, like there were times where it was up to 6 weeks out. We would be, within 100 kilometers of a village. So if so we take with us, a giant sack of staples like rice, potatoes, pasta, a big wheel of cheese. And if we get low on some of those things, once or twice, someone would get in the smaller truck and go into town and get some stuff. But we ate a lot of fish. We'd park right next to these rivers. We'd fish for our food. Over the years, we developed these good contacts with local hunters, so we get meat sometimes from these guys. But it was largely, big sacks of stuff we brought with us and fish that we caught.
This actually leads into a great next question. So someone wants to know, what things did you bring people from the USA?
Usually stuff in one way or another associated with hunting. So for example, ski skins were really popular. Russians tend to use, instead of snowshoes, they use what they call hunter skis, which are relatively short, fat skis that they use not really as the way we would use skis to kind of get speed and go somewhere, but they're more like shuffle atop really deep snow. And the terrain there is hilly, and so it's pretty slippery trying to go up these low rises on just skis that are just have no texture on the bottom. So ski skins are something that are lightweight. You can just they just glue right to the bottom of the ski, and you can then kind of go up some of these inclines. So that was probably the most popular thing that I bring over.
And so now we're going to move on to an especially Paul Sweet question from Paul Sweet, and that's, what's the current thinking on the genus? Bubo or Katupa? Sure looks like a Katupa to me.
Yeah, and I'm not a geneticist. It's not an argument that I wade into with much knowledge. That said, I think it's absurd that they're in Bubo. I think the reasons that I've seen seem rather arbitrary to exclude a Blackestons, but keep in a brown, because there's 4 fish owl species. There's Blackestons is the northernmost and the largest. Then there's Buffy, Tawny, and Brown. And Blackestons is essentially a giant brown. They look the same. So I encourage people like Paul who know about these things to challenge the status quo and bring them back to Katupa. So.
Yeah, maybe Paul will challenge the world with that. So we have 3 questions that are similar, and it's people wanted to know about your language skills. So someone wants to know, what languages do you speak, and were you familiar with the language prior to Peace Corps? And do you speak any local language or local dialect?
Yeah, so I have a long history with languages. My father was a U.S. diplomat, so I grew up in different countries. I mean, my first language was actually Spanish. I lived in Uruguay and Panama until I was about 5. So my brother and I would speak Spanish to each other and English to my parents. And then I lived in Germany for 4 years. I spoke German when I was in Germany. Then I lived in Canada, so I took some French when I was there. But all the languages that I used to speak in the past were kind of taken over by whatever language I was learning. And my dad was stationed in Moscow in the early 90s. So I started studying Russian in high school, and then ended up majoring in it in college. And I spent 6 months there as an undergraduate and 3 years in the Peace Corps. And so, yeah, I mean, this part of Russia is not a place you can go without reasonable Russian language skills. I mean, you don't want to be in the middle of the woods and go through the ice and trying to articulate your peril to your companions if you can't do that in a language they understand. So Russian is essential to work in this kind of place.
Okay, so there's I said I wouldn't ask you any will you take me there questions, but these are tangentially related, and there's a couple I'm going to combine that were interesting. And one, someone wants to know if there's opportunities for ecotourism in the area, which is code for will you take me there. But another one that is sort of related is, what's the general attitude of the local population towards conservation efforts and local government too?
Okay. First question about the ecotourism. It is just starting to bud there. I mean, there was for a long time, under the Soviet system, there were the Zapovedniks, which is a nature reserve. Those were the people were excluded from those. I mean, scientists and reserve guards could go there. And so it's really since the fall, in the last 10 years or so, even less, that these reserves are being encouraged to have some kind of component for the public. And so, like, for example, there was an Indian tourist visited Land of the Leopard National Park a few years ago, and it made the newspaper that somebody came to Land of the Leopard National Park and liked it, you know. So it's really just, there's not a lot of infrastructure built for going out there. I will say that the guy I work with, Sergei Surmich, he does lead small eco tours for people who want to go over there and just hit up a bunch of the birds. The second question was, I forget.
It was more about what's the general population, what's the local government's attitude or the local population's towards conservation efforts.
Right. You know, I think it's pretty similar to the urban-rural divide in the United States, where, you know, you go to, you know, New York or Minneapolis, where I am. There's a lot of sympathy and interest in apex predators, for example. You know, like, I like wolves, you know, but you go to a place where wolves are directly or potentially directly impacting the livelihoods of people who live there, then, you know, people don't like them as much. And it's the same with tigers. So in Vladivostok, everyone loves tigers. There's a holiday there once a year. It should have been a weekend or two ago, if not for COVID, where the whole city shuts down. You know, 50,000 people converge on the center of town. Everyone dresses up, you know, face paint with tigers. They run around talking about how much they like tigers. But then you go into Ternay County, where I work, where there are these villages, and people view the tigers as threats to their livelihoods. Like, either that tiger is going to eat a deer, or I'm going to shoot that deer and feed my family with it. So there are some misconceptions about predators that, you know, what the Wildlife Conservation Society, who I work for, is trying to, you know, I guess, impart better understanding of how predators impact an ecosystem. As far as the fish owls, people don't really know about these birds. They tend to flush at 100, 150 yards if someone's approaching. So even people who live their whole lives around fish owls don't necessarily know they're there. And since the owls since they're relatively benign, you know, people have more important things to worry about than an owl. So they just don't really care.
So we have a couple of questions people have asked that is about the loggers. So one person asked, how did you get the loggers to work with you, or why were they receptive? And someone asked that in another way and just, you know, speculates that it's uncommon. So what were how did you make this happen?
Well, I think, honestly, a big part of it is my personal experiences there in Ternay counties. I've been, you know, going there since the year to Ternay since 1999, and, you know, I have a good network of local contacts. You know, it spans from scientists to hunters to loggers, and you know, the guy who runs one of the affiliates of the big logging company he's a local boy. You know, he grew up in this village of 800 people. The logging company is the dominant employer there. He has a hunting lease. He hunts nearby, and so when I go to him, you know, someone who he recognizes as someone who knows the area and isn't a complete, even though I'm a foreigner, I'm not a complete outsider there, and just say, hey, look, if you do this, then you're going to have more. The habitat's going to be better for the deer on your hunting lease. It'll be better natural conditions for all the people in town. He's like, yeah, you know, he gets it because it directly impacts him. Where if it's this big conglomerate who's hiring someone who then goes into this area to log, of course they're not going to care as much. They're more interested in the bottom line. So I think that's one of the unique things, is just the hyper local connections, where these guys feel like they can trust me because we do have common interests. Like, yes, they still want to make as much money as they can, and I still want to protect as many fish owls as they can, but there is this space for common ground.
That's very hopeful. So back to sort of your field work. Two questions. What is the owl capture technique? Someone wants to know. And then someone else wants to know, how many owls did you tag in the end?
So as far as tagging owls, I think we got data from only 8, but since no one had done it before, that was enough for a PhD. But it was something like 30 captures, because we caught, some individuals we caught every year for 4 years. So it was a bunch of capture events of I believe it was 8 individuals. And the way we ended up catching them was using fish as lures, and that was the key thing that we'd been missing. Again, so each owl territory might have 2 or 3 unfrozen river patches, and so there's only so many places they can hunt. And so by we put a little mesh box, a shallow mesh box in a part of the river that was shallow, caught fish nearby, put 15 to 20 in this little box, and then the second the owls found that was it. I mean, they'd be there. It might take them a week to find it. Once they did, they would eat all the fish. They'd sit there guarding it, almost like wondering when more fish would appear. And that was the lure. So once we had them coming in, then we put a snare just there and would catch them in a snare. So the whole capture process would take about an hour. From the bird being snared to us grabbing it was like 20 seconds, because we were just watching right nearby in a blind. So it's all very fast and relatively safe.
So we have 2 questions that are related to the rivers. One, someone wanted to know, does the radiation of the rivers have an effect on the local population? And then someone else wanted to know, river related, are you looking at any of the fish prey species to understand another limiting factor for the fish owls besides nest trees?
Yeah, and for the second question. I mean, that's one future line of study that I'd love to dig into more. I mean, for my degree program, I did relative abundance of fish, so I did some fish stuff, but I think we need to do a lot more to better understand that, because there is a lot of fishing pressure. But this whole project, it's essentially me and Sergey. It's like 5% of my job now is doing fish owls. And Sergey is busy too. He does, most bird projects in the Russian Far East he's involved in one way or another. So we try to scrape together a grant every year to do work, and we do something every year, but it depends on how much time we have and how much money we're able to put together. As for the first question, which I already forgot, I'm sorry.
It was about the radiation in the rivers. Mm-hmm.
So actually, there's people seek the radiation out. It's viewed as therapeutic. People go and spend, in the warmer months especially, they'll go spend a week at some of these radon hot springs, soaking in it to cure. There's a whole range of maladies that are ostensibly cured or tempered by the exposure. But they're also, there's a lot of water. There's a lot of waterways, and so people don't go to a radon hot spring to get their drinking water. They'll just go somewhere else. And so I don't think there's a threat to the population as a whole.
That's good news. I'm going to ask 2 more questions. And one is just, someone wants to know how the owls actually fish. Do they stand in the water and fish, or do they dive like an osprey?
It's a great question. All of my observations of hunting have been in winter, and they're only hunting in really shallow water, like 10, 15 centimeters. And they sit on the bank and watch. They wait for, they pick these areas that's the riffle. So it's kind of between 2 pools where the water is shallower and flows kind of right on top of these pebbles. And so the fish are more exposed then, and they just sit on the bank and then jump in. They put their wings up, talons out, and just kind of land on it. There's a Japanese fish owl biologist named Sumio Yamamoto, who's kind of one of the driving forces of the conservation campaign there since the 80s. And he has a whole list of different hunting behaviors, including a full-on osprey dive. But I personally haven't seen it, but I believe him if he says he has.
Okay, in the last question, and several people asked this, and it wasn't something I would have anticipated, but everyone seems to want to know, do you ever take your wife with you?
Well, no. We met in the Peace Corps over there, so she didn't live near me, but so she's familiar with Fimoria. She speaks a little Russian. She knows the area. We did go back. I have two kids now. They're 8 and 4. When the older one was just a year old, she came over with him, and it was just a total nightmare. I mean, it was a 2-week trip. I anticipated all kinds of stuff. What I did not anticipate was jet lag in a 1-year-old, and the fact that most of my friends seem to keep their knives at knee level. So this 1-year-old just starting to walk is running around middle of the night because he's jet lagged, grabbing knives. So it was just awful.
I mean, that sounds like it could be good material for your next book. Jet lag and toddlers. So
I'm eager to go back with my family, but the kids need to be older.
Okay, well, that's it for tonight. Jonathan, thank you so much again. I'm going to pass this back to Ken, who's going to adjourn the meeting. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Rochelle.
Wow. That was amazing. Thank you, Rochelle, for handling those questions so beautifully. And Jonathan, I could listen to you all night. I really could. That was an outstanding, fantastic presentation. I'm reading this book right now, enjoying it page by page. It's hard to put down, but first of all, I advise everyone to get it. Get a copy of Owls of the Eastern Ice. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, you will love this book. As I said, it's hard to put down, but after I spoke with Jonathan and he told me that it took him 5 years to write this book, and he hears that people read it in one weekend, it's sort of discombobulating. So I'm enjoying it slowly, gradually, word by word, page by page. It's an amazing account. It's an adventure story. It's science. It's nature. It's far away, remote places. Everything I love. And that was a terrific presentation, Jonathan.
Thank you.
I wish you well in your continued efforts, especially the conservation efforts that are so remarkable. It sounds like what you're doing beyond when the science papers are finally finished and published, you're actually doing really important work out there. So I wish you well in all those future endeavors, and maybe you could come back and speak for us again sometime.
Yeah, thanks. I'd love to.
So thank you all, everybody. I hope that everyone who had the opportunity to be with us tonight will return. And there were 202 people. That's a record for us, anytime, anywhere. But I hope many of you will return for next month's program, when we will present Matthew Combs and Rats in the City, Ecological and Conservation Implications of a Global Pest. Until then, good birding, everyone. Stay healthy, stay active, stay positive, and have a good night.